Yeah, so it's just, again, based on your feedback last year, again, I made this simplified Gantt version, which I'm very proud of, very clear. So there, basically, that's what we're going to do. Session 1, Intro to ZBrush. Then next week and the following weeks, you will be doing some self-study. There's a bunch of tutorials that I would want you to watch because it's very helpful to watch different artists work in ZBrush. So yeah, next session after that we'll do maquette sculpting, which is basically sculpting a full body creature or character of sorts. Just looking at how you can approach that in ZBrush. And so I make the distinction like what's a maquette and what's a full body character. So a maquette usually then you would refer to like a conceptual sculpt. So that would be like a maquette, and a full body character you can imagine it would be having accessories and just a little bit more finalized, like with clothing and accessories and everything you need. Or not, if it doesn't have accessories. Session 4 then, so this portion of the course then would be more ZBrush, 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 you know, getting used to sculpting inside of ZBrush. Not so technical. It's obviously also some technical things related to ZBrush that we have to learn, but it's not very technical. It's kind of intuitive. This session though, when we're starting to do a production mesh or production model in November, this will be very technical. So it's like retopologizing, making UVs, baking out maps, essentially, so that we could make a model look like it does in ZBrush in a game engine, more or less. So you would export normal maps and all of that. So you would retopologize depending on your needs, like how low poly do you want it to be, or anywhere in between, depending on whatever it is that you're doing. If you're doing like a mobile game, you know, you would obviously take that into consideration. But poly count today is much less of an issue than it used to be, and it's much less computationally heavy than image maps and so forth. So probably, yeah. So these topics we'll talk more about when we're doing retopologizing, and again talking more about topology and all that. And then session after that, we'll do a full body attempt to do a full body production model. We will not have time to do that in one session, but it's to give you an idea of what you would what that would entail, like to finish a complete full body character or creature. And so the final delivery then would be December 6th. And the hand-ins for the course, they're all PDFs, like you were used to doing these reflection papers. You don't. When it comes to the reflection part, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's essentially, you can refer to the Gibbs reflective cycle, that we did last year, but you don't have to follow it like line by line by line. It's just kind of internalizing that, okay, maybe I should talk a little bit about how did I feel doing this? Just refer to it more like a guide when you're writing, and you can write a paragraph or two. It doesn't have to be very excessive. But it's also quite important that you try to show progress. You try to show progression in just like last year. If you can, try to show progression in your work so that you're not just showing off the finished work. And this, of course, again, it has to do with also to document that you actually made this, so that you didn't have a friend make it for you or download it somewhere. So, because unfortunately this happens sometimes, and yeah, hello. And so, yeah, welcome.
Yeah.
Are you deciding whether you want to enter or not?
Are we using ZBrush here?
Yes.
Okay. You're going over the course product, I'm assuming?
Yeah, the progress. But we will be starting with ZBrush today. So this class is basically all about ZBrush, and like I said, but here in November, then more technical things. So as far as the hand-ins, the first thing I want you to do, which is due September 24th, you will be making 3 conceptual busts. And this is will be very straightforward. I think if you follow along today, you already have one essentially. So it just depends. It's up to you. How far do you want to take it? I just want you to basically deliver 3 conceptual busts. A bust is just from the shoulders up of some kind of character or creature or whatever. So it's not, like I said, it's not super technical. It's just depending on you, how far do you want to take it and experiment with it. Okay. And then for the next assignment, then I will ask you to do 1 character maquette, so that's a full body sculpt of sorts. Could be anything. And yep, hand in here November 6th. The final thing, you will do a production model, which entails retopologizing, making UVs, and baking out normal maps. Or other maps, if you want to, we can take a look at that. But yeah, essentially no texturing per se, but making sure that everything is ready so that essentially the model could now be ready for texturing, or 3D printing if anyone's interested in that. I think we're going to get a couple of printers. If some of you would be interested, you can experiment with printing. As far as you have something in ZBrush, you can obviously print it. There's the technical, again, things to talk about. You'd have to optimize the mesh for printing. One of the things being that you would define a very carefully constructed thickness throughout the mesh so that you're not printing the whole thing solid, just to save material and also the printing time. Yeah, anyway, so the mandatory thing there is that you do 1 production mesh, which would be one of the busts, so it could be one of the ones you produced over here. If you want to make a new one, you can do that. You hand that in December 6th. So it's very doable, I think. Just for the and also there's an optional one. The optional assignment is to do a production model of the full body character. Yep.
Everything is handed in on Canvas or somewhere else?
Everything is handed in through Canvas, so all of the hand-ins are simply PDFs. So make sure you actually use the PDF format, so not JPEGs or Targets or TIFFs or anything, just PDF. And you can upload a PDF. So all of these are just PDFs of images of your work. And then, like I was saying earlier, it would be good if you can show some progression so that you make sure to save some iterations so that you can go back and show a little bit how you worked and write up, a couple paragraphs. How did you approach it? It doesn't have to be, it's up to you. How far do you want to take it as far as the report? But the optional task then is to do a production model of a full body character. So that would be, any infinitely number of accessories or whatever you want to do. The more you have, the more work. So you would have to then retopologize every single thing and make UVs for it and so forth. But we're going to look at some automatic retopologizing tools in ZBrush, which they're limited, but you can get pretty decent topology with a couple of clicks. So that will definitely be a huge time saver, and essentially, especially for like in-game objects that are not characters. Also, I mean that you can anything that's not going to be deforming. Essentially, the topology is not that crucial. If you have a hero character, and yeah, you do want to establish really good facial topology, radial topology around the eyes and the mouth, and so forth. But you can get pretty decent, even for that, you can get pretty decent topology now automatically in ZBrush. So that we're going to look at all that. So if you have been trying some modeling characters before, I don't know, do you have any experience? Anyone tried ZBrush before or other sculpting softwares? 3 people, yeah. So I mean, the workflow with characters and creatures, everything used to be that you would first start out with the modeling, and maybe you would have a very defined concept art, and then you would take that into Maya in a orthographic view, and then model a very precise model and have the topology perfect, and then you would take that into ZBrush just to do some sculpting on top of that and so forth. But now it's kind of turned on its head, so we just start with the sculpt. You can of course have a 2D concept art if you want, but even you don't really need to. There's a lot of concept artists today that are using ZBrush because you can use what we're going to look at today, Dynamesh, which is essentially a technique that allows us to just sculpt freely. We can literally do anything we want to a sculpt, and so you can start with the sculpt and worry about all the technical aspects later. So that's why this is scheduled out this way. So it will be very technically heavy at the end here. So I do, yeah, just be prepared for that. There might be some issues going back and forth and baking and all of that. It's always a little bit to get used to, but I think you'll be fine. No, I know you'll be fine, but we'll be there will be some experimentation. All right. So okay, what else? So that was the course progress. Description of all the sessions we're going to do. You can go and look at that. But as far as the assessment, we can have a brief look at that. You can just go in here and read it later. I'm not going to cover it in detail, but essentially, this is the document that everyone who's involved with assessing your work will be given. So that's me essentially and another internal examiner. But if you choose to contest the grade, then this will go out to the external examiner. Or the external examinators. I think there are two. So essentially, all of the tasks are here, the same descriptions as in your assignments. And then you don't have to worry about this. It's just if you're interested in knowing the weighting and how this is assessed, I will just briefly mention it. So there are 3 elements of assessment per assignment. So there's the reflection paper. You see it only counts 20% of the grade. It's not a big deal, and that'll be fine. The main thing here would be the sculpting, obviously, and production model 0, because there is no production model for this A1, nor is it for the A2. For the A3, this is where we're doing the production model of the head, so you can see the reflection paper again, 20%. The sculpting here is only 30%. It could be like 0, because there's no actual, you don't have to sculpt a new model in that assignment. But if you choose to do it, you will be credited for it. So it counts for something, so the sculpting counts. But essentially the production model counts half of that grade. And yeah. In addition, there's a weighting of like per assignment, and this is all designed to benefit you so that you can see that the later assignments actually count more towards the final result. So that you can have a progression in the course and still achieve like a good grade. So what I actually do, I calculate on all of this 3 different numbers. So the first one is a straight average. That's just an average of everything you've done, all of the scores. It does not include a weighting of the assignments. Then I do, well, I don't, it's like in the format here, this will calculate the weighted average without the optional one, and this one will calculate the weighted average with the optional one. So there are 3 numbers, and whichever is most beneficial for you will be the basis for the letter grade. So if you're really interested, you can go in there. It's all in there as far as the assessment. Yeah, and if you want to have a look at the various sessions, you can go in here, and there's a brief description of what we will be covering. So, but that's basically what I just went over. Okay, so any questions about the progress and hand-ins? And yeah. Not as far as I know. I think the floating licenses will only work on these computers.
They very recently released a student license, so you can get it. I personally at least get Photoshop and everything in the Adobe package.
Okay.
At a heavily discounted price. If you have your student information, actually give that to them.
Okay, so that's nice. So Pixelogic they have now like a cloud.
It would have been nice for them
Student.
to release that at the start of last year, though.
Right. But now they have a student license you can get, Pixelogic.
Yes.
Okay. Kind of like Autodesk does.
Removed it
Right.
again, though.
Oh, okay.
As far as
So,
I know, it should be up there. I'll double check.
right. Yep. No, I don't think our license or the school's licenses. I think they will only work here. So, but no, I don't know. Right. So okay, that's that. And what else? Reading list. If you go down here to the reading list, there's not a lot to read. There's an old book here by Scott Spencer. She is now called Madeline Spencer. Used to be Scott, but this is a good book. He talks or she talks about some like primary, secondary, tertiary shape. She's a classically trained artist, so it's an interesting book, I think, for that purpose. Even though it's now a bit dated, so if you want to get it or not, some sections in there are interesting. This book, has anyone read it? Creativity.inc. You have? It's on your reading list. I do recommend it. It's by Ed Catmull, CEO of Pixar and Disney. Yeah, you liked it. It's about. I mean, I think it should be like everyone who's ever attempting to collaborate creatively should consider having a look at that, because they've done something right at Pixar, and he makes some very interesting observations and comments on how their different strategies. So, and some required tutorials. So those would be then what I really encourage you to start looking at next week and the following weeks. But really just get started with it, because let's open some of those later, and we'll have a look at it after we first start in ZBrush a little bit. But these are all from a yearly event called ZBrush Summit. So it's coming up now very soon. The ZBrush Summit is streaming live from Gnomon School in LA, and it's Pixologic's annual event. So they invite various artists from the game industry and film industry and toy industry and jewelry. There's one site you should get familiar with, ZBrush Central. This is Pixologic's own website. There are some there's like a C classroom. There are some tutorials in here, different things, some articles that are interesting, interviews with various artists and their approaches to things. And there's a gallery, so they would post like the best of the best that's made using ZBrush, or in which ZBrush was somehow involved. Some like examples from industry, but also freelancers and just anything cool could end up in here. So this would be a sculpt from God of War, it seems. This could potentially also be based on a photogrammetry model. I'm not sure, but they would probably tell you sometimes, or most often, they will comment on their process. So yeah, this was this and that, and rendered in this and that. So it's kind of interesting. Anyways, so I recommend having a look at that gallery. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, you do need a tablet. So if you don't have a tablet today, you can still follow along, like at least learning some things about ZBrush. But to work in ZBrush, you do need a tablet. With the mouse, you only have like 1 point of pressure. You either press the button or you don't. With the tablet, we have like 2048 points of pressure. So it's all about like getting used to the pressure sensitivity of the pen. That will heavily influence the work. So you can obviously use a mouse in ZBrush also for some purposes. ZBrush is kind of interesting in any pipeline, I think, because it opens up some possibilities. Like, for instance, if you have let's say you have a CG asset with textures, and now you want to change the UVs, but you want to keep the textures, or you want to change the topology. In ZBrush, you can take the model in there, and you can bake the textures down to polypaint, and then you can do whatever you want, and then you can bake it out again to the new UVs. For instance, it's like one of those things that you can do in ZBrush, which is very handy in a pipeline. And other things, height maps. You can do all sorts of interesting things with alphas. It's not only to sit down and sculpt something in Dynamesh. So even for those of you who might not be that into character design or creature design, doing these assignments is just a nice way, anyways, to get familiarized with the interface. And I assure you, if you're going to be working like within any pipeline, it's really helpful knowing it. Yeah. Uh, s- yeah. So any Wacom tablet would be okay, but on these labs, you need a Wacom Pro for the driver to work properly. So if you're getting a Wacom, just get a Pro version. You don't need the big ones, just any size, fine. I personally, I don't like the larger tablets. I like the medium-sized ones. Yeah, but you do need a Pro. You do need a Pro version. It's a good investment. I mean, you'll have that for years. It's a good investment. Okay, so if you go down here and you search for Wacom, some people say Wacom, some people say Wacom. I don't know what I say. I vary. This should show up, Wacom tablet properties. If it doesn't show up, it means that the driver is not installed. And then if that ever happens, it could happen potentially here. Either your tablet is not connected well, or it could be some hardware problem with the tablet, but most probably it's a driver issue. So then please notify Tor Eric, who's the IT person you need to contact for that. Whenever something happens with any software, it's very nice if you actually bother to let Tor Eric know and give him the number of the computer. I think they're posted on the back of the monitor or something. Yeah. Anyways. But yeah, so just change computers right now if that happens. But you should find Wacom tablet properties. Then you should see something like this. So there's a couple of things that we're going to do. So first off, if you hold the pen and just press it, if you go to this pen menu, you should see the pressure reacting. So these are the, the 2048 points of pressure. And you should see that happening. If not, again, there's a problem with the driver, most likely. Another thing that's good to do, this is initially set up to be right-click. We don't need that. If you set it to be middle-click, now we have a 3-button solution, so you can use the pen in Maya. So this would be, click, right-click, middle-click, left-click, then essentially right-click and middle-click. So that's nice to do. And as far as the mapping, go to mapping. And if you're using the tablet in Photoshop, at least this used to be the case last year, probably still is in Windows, you have to actually have Windows Ink activated to get the tablet pressure working. But in ZBrush, we don't have to do that. So in ZBrush, I always turn off Windows Ink because it actually causes a bit of a lag on the tablet, and it's actually a problem when we're working in ZBrush, or it can be. So I turned that off. And also, you probably just want to set this to be working on just one of the monitors. So currently, you see this is set to monitor 1. It's going to be one monitor that I'm working with. And I also engaged force proportions, and you can see what happens there. Hard to see, but it will not use the entire tablet. But what I get is that the aspect ratio is perfect. So when I'm drawing a circle on the tablet, I'm actually drawing a circle on the monitor. So it's actually very important. So you do want to force the proportions. So there you go. So those are the couple of things that you'd go in here and do. And then we should be good to go. So if you open up ZBrush, currently some of these computers have ZBrush 4.8 or 4.7. This is ZBrush 2018, and so some of the computers here have a ZBrush 2018. It's not a big deal for what we're going to be doing today. It will be literally the same program with a couple of exceptions. But some of the big changes in 2018 is that there are improved hard surface modeling capabilities. So we're not going to be doing a lot of hard surface modeling in ZBrush in this class. Nice for you to try something new and try some organic sculpting. But also, I don't really know hard surface modeling in ZBrush, so I couldn't teach you that. But I encourage you to try it. It's getting really good. They have a C modeler, they call it. So it's definitely the case now that you can just build everything, model everything, and sculpt everything inside of ZBrush, which is nice. Like with your experience with polygonal modeling in Maya or anywhere else, it's pretty much the same. So I just haven't gotten around to playing with that yet. Okay, so let's get started. So initially when you open up ZBrush, it looks something like this. You have this menu. So if you want to follow along today, we're going to do it like this. We're just going to, essentially if you follow along, we're going to try to just make a little bust. So see what happens. Yeah? Yeah, you can do it with a mouse, and then, yeah, just for today, and then you'll at least get into the workflows and things. So it is possible to work with a mouse. It's just that you will not have any pen pressure, obviously. You will have 1 point of pressure, which is no pressure. No. So, but you'll, it's fine. So, all right. So when you open up, you'll see this menu. You can make that go away by hitting the comma key, or make it appear back. So I'm going to select one of these template projects just so we can have a look at it. For instance, this one. If I double click it, it's going to open up that project. So first of all, let's look at how we can navigate around. You just press your pen down somewhere in the gray area, and you can rotate around. And up and down, or around. If you, like you would in Maya, just have your left hand, or if you're right-handed, your right hand, but have them on Control, Alt, and Shift. And then if I hold Shift while I'm tumbling around, it will snap to the various views. So that's very useful. So I'm over here and I just want to centralize it. Just hold Shift at the same time. And then to move the camera around, we can hold Alt. So hold Alt and just go like that. You're no longer tumbling around, but you're actually moving. You're not moving the object, we are moving the camera around. And then to go in and out, you can hold Alt, put the pen down. Don't let go of the pen, but let go of Alt. And then take the pen up and down. So hold Alt, put the pen down, let go of Alt, and move the pen up and down. So that seems a little unnecessarily clumsy, but it's designed obviously to use a tablet, so you get used to it and it just becomes kind of natural. It's kind of quick because if I just want to move, I hold Alt, but I just tap Alt very quickly and I can go in and out. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. All right. So that's moving around. I'm going to open up a new project. So I press comma. We're going to open up one of these spheres. So one of these called Dynamesh Sphere. So Dynamesh Sphere 128, for instance. Just double click that. No, I don't want to save changes. Press comma to make that go away. You can also click there. This is the light box. We can show the wireframe. Shift F. So what we are looking at is a polygonal object. It just has a lot of these polygons. This is a Dynamesh sphere, so we'll get back to that in a minute, what Dynamesh is all about. But Shift F, turn on and off the wireframe. So let's try out some brushes on the surface here, on this polygonal object. So first of all, you can see that currently we have the standard brush enabled. Let's just try that. So if you start drawing on top of the model, it's displacing the surface. So the harder you press the pen, the more of a volume change, or if you're very subtle and just gently press the pen, it will just gently raise the surface. So it's not actually adding polygons, it's only displacing the existing vertices around. But it feels kind of like you're adding volume, right? Or subtracting. So to subtract volume, you hold Alt and draw. So add, subtract. The third thing would be to hold Shift. That actually enables another brush called the smooth brush. So when you hold Shift, I'm smoothing things out. So you're adding volume, subtracting volume, smoothing things out. That's a lot of what we're doing when we're sculpting. Kind of exaggerating forms and smoothing them down. Exaggerating forms, smoothing them down. Okay, so then there are three basic settings for any brush. So it's the C intensity. So we have them up here. First, the C intensity. That's also the how strong of an effect the brush has. So it's not only the pressure of the pen, but also this. So if the C intensity is set too low, don't put an incredible amount of pressure on the pen. Just increase the C intensity, and you will get more of an effect. So now, even if I'm very gentle with the pen, the stroke is very prominent. Or if I take it down, I can be very subtle with it. So if you want very subtle strokes, just turn the C intensity down. I have to turn touch off on this tablet. Let's see, there we go. Okay, and initially there's a symmetry enabled. You see that we can work symmetrically, and that's along the x-axis by default, which is usually the width. Like you're used to the CG asset workflow where the x-axis is always the width, and that's the same in ZBrush. So if we import something that you modeled in Maya, for instance, it will be correctly aligned. So it's just a standard that the x-axis is usually the width. That's why it's enabled along the x-axis. If we change it up here, or first of all, you can turn it off. If you press X, you're no longer sculpting symmetrically. But if X is to enable or disable symmetry. So if we go up here to the stroke menu, transform menu. Here you see if I press X, you can see now I'm activating or deactivating symmetry. And here there are also other axes. Obviously you can do all three axes at once. You could do around the y-axis or the z-axis. And there's also a radial symmetry, which is very interesting. So if I activate that R, now you see now there's a radial symmetry enabled around the x-axis, so it will do that. Let me go back. So this is a history state, this slider. So if I go here, I can go back in time. And then I can go edit, delete, undo history. And now I'm back to start. So, okay, so if I increase the C intensity, now I have the radial symmetry enabled. And I go like that. You see I can do patterns like this. Hold Alt, I can carve in. Do like ornaments. Kind of interesting. So anyways, let me turn off radial symmetry. So you can achieve some interesting effects using radial symmetry. Now it's back to standard X along the X-axis. Okay, so that's C intensity. And then we have two others here. The focal shift. The focal shift is the hardness of the edge of the stroke. Like yeah, the hardness basically. How soft of a stroke do you want? So now it's pretty soft. If I increase the let's look. If you hold spacebar, you can actually get this menu up, and there you have draw size, focal shift, and C intensity. The hotkeys, if you hover over these, you'll see the hotkeys. Hotkeys for C intensity is U, focal shift is O, and draw size is S. So if I press S, I can alter the draw size. If I press U, I can alter the C intensity. If I press O, I can alter the focal shift. So we go like that. Now the inner circle is very large, meaning that the stroke will be very hard and crude, like that. If I do a softer focal shift, it will be softer. the smaller the inner circle is, will affect the stroke. So yeah, S for draw size, so O for focal shift, and U for C intensity, or hold spacebar. These are new features. Remember draw size per brush. Okay. So now there's an option whether or not these settings should be global or if they're attached to per brush. Well, it's interesting. I actually prefer. Oh, draw size per brush. Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, so let's look at a new brush. We have a lot of brushes. No, before that, let's look at how the standard brush really functions. First of all, if we click here in the brush palette, you can see that there are a lot of brushes. You don't have to know all of these brushes. You don't even have to know a fraction of them to sculpt. They're just there if you want to experiment. I think most ZBrush artists probably have like 4 or 5 favorite brushes you use over and over again, and you can basically achieve anything using 4 or 5 brushes. So we're going to be looking at the most important brushes, and I think you can, like I said, achieve anything using them. But let's first look at the standard brush. So we can see underneath the actual brush icon, there's a stroke setting. So the current stroke, it has these dots, which kind of maybe seems a little misleading because this is just a standard stroke. But it is actually, mathematically, there are several little dots that are being placed. But for all intents and purposes, this is the standard normal stroke. But we also have like drag rectangular. If we try that, it will have a very different effect. You see, I'm dragging out the stroke on top of the surface. So the change you're seeing there is based on the height curve of the brush. So, the profile curve that this effect has. That can also be adjusted in the brush settings. I'm not going to do that now, but you can go in here. Essentially, you have a lot of control over the brush. You can adjust the curve, the height curve for this change, a whole bunch of settings essentially for a brush. And that's why all these brushes, they're basically customized standard brushes that are just saved out as various brushes for you. So you can customize your own brushes if you want, but yeah. Okay, so let's look at the next one. We'll leave the drag rectangular stroke on, and then we'll look at the next section here is for alphas. And this is I don't know if you've ever tried alphas like in Photoshop but essentially they're just black and white little images that will control the brush. They're masking off the brush. So let's just look at this. If we take this shape, for instance, alpha number 17, see, I can draw that onto the surface, and now it becomes maybe a little bit more evident what it's actually doing. It's just using this as a displacement when I'm drawing that stroke on there. So this is displacing the vertices. It's obviously, it's not adding any polys, it's just displacing the existing vertices that we have there. So you can see it looks a little crude, and that's just because we don't really have enough polys for this to be displayed nicer. We can add more polys, but we'll do that later. Or try out the alpha 7, go like that. So you see, yeah, we do need more definition for this to be nice. But anyways, that's sort of drag rectangular. Then we have spray. We can try that. Then we can use this and just spray it on. So it is actually displacing all of those vertices based on this alpha. If I have a more subtle effect, I can turn down C intensity, and I just get this like the surface noise effect all over. If I hold Alt, or just set it to C sub. So when you're pressing Alt on any brush, you're basically doing the opposite of whatever is set here. So C add is to add volume, C sub is to subtract volume. So we can also set this to C sub. Now it will always be going inward, subtracting volume. And then Alt would then go outward. Okay, so I can go back in time again. Delete history. I'm back. So I'm going to set this back to dots, and I'm going to turn alpha off. But that's essentially three different, or a couple of different important functions of the brush itself. And in addition, you can control a lot of, like I mentioned briefly, a lot of features here in the brush menu. We also have, in the stroke menu, we have something called lazy mouse. We can get back to that. Yeah, and symmetry like we just saw. So let me open up a new one. Dynamic sphere. Let's try another brush. So we're going to look at clay buildup. So the hotkey system in ZBrush to select brushes works like this. First of all, you can press B, that stands for brush, and then you'll just open the brush palette. That's the same as just clicking there. But you can click B, it will open the brush palette. And then you just start with the first letter of the brush. So if I'm looking for the clay buildup, it's on C. So here are all the brushes starting with C. And you got to find clay buildup. It's there. It's on B. And now I'm in clay buildup. So BCB would be the hotkey combination to get that brush. Like, yeah. There are ways to customize this. So if you have like 4 brushes you always use, most artists would have them and set up your own hotkeys so that they would be, for instance, on 1, 2, 3, 4. But yeah, a lot of artists do that. I typically always just use the standard UI, and also because I'm teaching, so that we're looking at the same thing. But it's highly customizable, so you can really make it your own. But anyways, this is the default way the hotkey function here is set up. So BCB, you're in clay buildup. So let's try clay buildup. It really feels even more like you're kind of adding volume. You have a little bit more refined control over those volumes. And then press Shift again to go into smooth, and we can even out that result. So the C intensity is, initially is actually, you're setting that per brush. So when I'm holding Shift, I'm actually entering the smooth brush. So it will have its own C intensity. So if I'm holding Shift, you see it enters smooth brush. And I can then hold Shift and lower the C intensity on the smooth if I wanted a more of a subtle effect. So now you can just start experimenting with shapes and volumes. You can see that it really matters, of course, the draw size. If you're just working with a very small brush, you can do little things like this. But if I'm having a larger draw size and you're being a little bit more bold, just go do a little bit larger strokes and use smooth. You can see I can really start establishing large volumes just using clay buildup. So either like Alt, hold Alt, and carve in, or carve out and then smooth out. You see gradually I'm starting to sculpt this volume. And then also the distance at which you're observing the mesh makes a big difference. So if I'm way out here, it's actually easier to do large changes than if I'm in here. So just get used to that. Sometimes it's very beneficial to be farther away and observing it a little bit farther away. So like I said, you could essentially sculpt anything just with the clay buildup, and smooth. So you see what the clay buildup is actually doing. It has an alpha like this. We're now familiar with alphas, and it has some other customized settings. But it is essentially a brush that you could obviously just make yourself and then store it as a customized brush. Alright, let's look at one more brush. The Damien standard is very handy, the BDS. B for brush, D for Damien. It says DAM standard, Damien standard, and press S, BDS. So you can see that has a very pointy alpha, and it also is initially set to C sub. So we know that it's going to be very pointy, and it's going to punch into the mesh because it's set to C sub. It's not set to C add, it's set to C sub.
What was it, B?
BDS, it's called DAM standard. So that will predict, like we predicted, it has it's slashing into the mesh. Makes these harsher lines. So a lot of artists like this brush because you can just accentuate detail. So that when you're sculpting, you're going in there with the Damien standard and accentuating forms. So that's that, and let's look at Move, the Move brush. So BMV. This is a very different type of brush. You can just, if you start drawing, it's very unpredictable. But this is just to move things. So you grab a hold of the mesh and you start moving it. So if the draw size is very little, you see I'm just pulling out a little section. But if you increase the draw size, I can use the Move brush more or less like I'm altering large chunks of this mesh. It's a very useful tool. See, and also observing the model more at a distance here makes this easier. Because if I'm in here and I have a lower draw size, this is more clunky. I'm not reading the volume very well. But if I'm out here, I can really read the silhouette, see what I'm doing, have a larger draw size, just try to be a little bit more bold with the strokes and just try out things. Or I could, alright, so let's now try something, if I make very large changes. So if I just I have Move brush enabled, and I just move out this section like this. I make a very large change. Like I'm moving out this entire row like this. If I press Shift F to look at the polys, you can see that now all these polys are starting to get stretched. It's still not so extreme, but let's make it a little more extreme. Let's like drag out sections that I would have for the body or something. Something like that. For the bust. See, Shift F, now these are really stretched out. And that's a problem because I go BCB and I want to sculpt here. You can see that, well, it still kind of works, but here it doesn't work. See, it's very unpredictable. Because I do need polys to be able to sculpt. All these brushes are displacing the vertices that are there. So this is what Dynamesh is. This can be solved with Dynamesh. So since I started this from a Dynamesh sphere, all I have to do is hold Control and make it like a rectangular selection off to the side, and that will recompute the Dynamesh. If I press Shift F, you can see that we've now recomputed, so I have polys evenly distributed everywhere. So that seems like a little innocent trick, but actually this kind of revolutionized, basically turned everything on its head. Now you can just start sculpting and do whatever you want. There are no technical limitations per se. You don't have to worry about topology or anything. You can just really see how far can you push it in the sculpt. So, and then later we can worry about topology. So then you would then retopologize and make UVs and to whichever resolution you want. So essentially, the sculpt itself is always very high. Well, not always, depends on the concept, but you can basically define the character very high poly, completely regardless of the output, even if it's for like a mobile game or whatever. The artwork would still be high poly, to use that term. So Shift F, you can see that evenly distributed. So all we did was control, drag a rectangular marquee to the side, and whenever you do that, it will recompute. So let's look at another tool, snake hook. So BSH snake hook. That will just drag out sections just for the purpose of like showing. If I do something like crazy like that, very dragged out, but I just go like this, and it's recomputing, and now I have polys everywhere. Let me undo that. All right. So yeah, maybe just try a little bit with clay buildup, move brush, Damien standard, and just experiment with forms. See if we can arrive at something interesting. One more thing with the move brush though, BMV. If you hold Alt, you can actually pull the mesh out according to its normal. So I'm not only pulling this way or that way, I'm actually pulling straight out according to this normal. Holding Alt and just dragging to the side. That's very handy. See, with the move brush I can just keep experimenting with these shapes. And we're completely free. At any time I can recompute. Now I have fresh polys. So whenever the mesh starts getting a little clunky and difficult to work with, you simply recompute the Dynamesh. So there's nothing really magical about we started this from a Dynamesh sphere, but you can enable Dynamesh from any mesh. So if we go in the tool menu here down to geometry, you can find the Dynamesh feature. So it's here. As long as this is enabled, it will recompute the mesh whenever you go like that. Hold Control and do that drag to the side, and it will generate a poly count relating to this resolution setting. So if you want more polys, you have to enter more numbers here. Here's active points, gives you an indication of the poly count. So this is like around 240,000 polys currently. So we are dealing with polygons. It is a polygonal object. It's just a completely new way of working with polygons than we're used to from Maya, obviously. But technically it's the same. So don't worry too much about I wouldn't worry too much about the content for now. Just have a little fun with the trying out different shapes. And then at any point, we could make some pretty large changes using the move brush. Keep experimenting with, observe the contours, move away from the object. Make sure you're also observing it at a distance. Try to analyze the contours. What are you doing? Move things around. Just experiment. Alright, let's see if there are some other brushes. So move Damien Standard, clay buildup. Yeah, the pinch brush sometimes can be useful. So BPI for pinch. It pinches together the mesh. So you can see, if we try that here, see it just pinches it together into like that. If you have a larger draw size, I can also just pinch. See, it can pinch pretty large sections like that. So yeah, so the opposite of pinching would be to inflate it, and then we have BIN, which is inflate, and that will more or less like blow air into the mesh, so it'll increase the volume. Sometimes that's very useful if you have very tiny little parts. So if I do BSH snake hook and I go like that, if this is too tiny, it's actually kind of difficult except using inflate. But with inflate, I can literally just, it's like blowing air into there and just increase it. So inflate and pinch, very handy. So I think for the most part, like for a lot of these volumes, if you're making like the raw sculpting, I think for the most part, clay buildup will serve you well. Just building volume, subtracting volume, smoothing out, and then sort of to accentuate details, Damien Standard. Alright, other brushes. Right. So we're working symmetrically, and typically you can just keep everything perfectly symmetrical for the most part during the conceptual phase. It's actually nice to also have access to a perfectly symmetrical model for the purposes of retopologizing and so forth. Depending on the level of asymmetry you want, you might want to actually also have a slightly asymmetrical model when you do the retopologizing. Or you could choose to retopologize it and then add some asymmetry later. But in the end, essentially, you do want to add some asymmetry. Like a perfectly symmetrical creature or character is kind of, it's very artificial. So the more asymmetry you add, though, the more creepy it will get. So. Okay, I think those are the basic brushes. We should definitely include. Other things would be the trim dynamic, so BTD. Trim dynamic is to do these more hard-edged look, like if I go like, just try it, it will carve more like this planar sections. So if I wanted this to be more of a, maybe it has some hard surface elements, or maybe it's a cyborg. But anyways, you can see the potential there to actually carve out some planar sections. So there are a couple of ways to approach like hard surface looking things in ZBrush. You can do this Dynamesh sculpting where everything is more conceptual, and then you apply these planar brushes and also pinch. So I could do BPI and pinch to accentuate those lines. See that now they're becoming very accentuated. And you can do that also for robots and mechs, you know, more like hard surface kind of things, using Dynamesh, and then retopologize it. Another approach would be to hard surface sculpt it. You know, so there are two different approaches, more or less, if you wanted these kind of hard surface looking things. But these kinds of techniques are done a lot also in ZBrush for things like robots, so BTD, because you can very quickly conceptualize something like that using these planar
What was the pinch hotkey again?
BPI. And then obviously maybe, what else? Well, we could now go BST standard and then implement some alphas, and I can change the drag rectangular. So I'm dragging some dots on there. Let's set it to C sub. You know, if I wanted to do that, or let's see, now I actually need more poly, so we're gonna go to the resolution here, maybe enter 500, and then recompute the Dynamesh. So now it's at, let's give it a minute, 3.4 million polys. And I can now maybe drag these down. You know, do different, let's see, I think if you hold, yeah, all sorts of things. There's a way to get that to snap to its size. I forget. It's not something I do a lot, but you can. There is a way to get that alpha to be consistent in the scale. I think you hold. Yeah, I don't know. I'll get back to that. But anyways, you can see the potential here is that everything, a lot could be in the sculpt. But now I just increased this to a ridiculous amount of polys by putting in a resolution of 500 and hitting Dynamesh again. But the power of Dynamesh is not those tertiary details. Okay, so typically when you approach a sculpt, you would think of it essentially in 3 stages. So in the primary stage, you're just establishing the silhouette, all the main volumes, all the forms. And that's the main bulk of the job. Like if you're working conceptually, arguably that's the most important thing, like figuring out the silhouette and the impact of the character. You know, is it a hero or a villain, or is he brave, or, you know, what kind of feeling do you want the character to convey? And a lot of that is posture and, you know, the main volumes, and a lot of that happens on in the primary stage. So we do not need a whole lot of polys. to do that. So that brings us over to kind of a different topic, and I want to the power, like I said, the main thing to take away from this is that the power of Dynamesh is just that you can keep, doing whatever you want, pulling out forms, experimenting with volume, and just recompute the Dynamesh at any time. There's no limitation. Okay, but that, of course, that's only useful when you're working conceptually. Once you have the volume established, and you want to add tertiary details, you don't really need Dynamesh. Then you could just subdivide this without using Dynamesh. Okay, so let's talk about the difference there. So I'm gonna leave this sculpt for now and just let's talk about, if there are no questions relating Dynamesh. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Like, it's pretty intuitive, right? You're just sculpting away and recomputing the Dynamesh, and you can use whatever brushes you want. So Damien standard move. Yeah, go ahead.
What really is the special feature of Dynamesh?
It's this. So I can do this. I can pull out any section I want. If I want to continue on with this body, I'll go, I want to drag this down. The problem without Dynamesh is that they become stretched. The polys become stretched, which is a problem for sculpting. If it weren't for Dynamesh, you couldn't do that. You would have to, yeah.
Very shortly said, you start with a little ball of clay, digitally, and with Dynamesh you're actually able to just like pull it out and then form it out without any sort of limitations, with one poly section being polys that are like this in size. It just reconfigures everything. So it keeps the polys. It essentially makes it so that you're just slapping more clay on that ball, so you can work in detail.
Yep.
At an infinite scale.
And when you do the control drag,
That's when you do that.
Yes.
That's when you reconfigure it. So if it weren't for that, if it weren't for that feature, we couldn't do this because we can't sculpt down here. That's the whole problem. So because look, when I try to sculpt here, it's a mess because the polys are too stretched. Up here I can still sculpt because I have polys there, but since I did this change, I need to reconfigure the Dynamesh so that I can keep sculpting down there. So I just control drag off to the side. Now I have fresh polys and I can sculpt. And like you said, shortly, but yeah, it's just like clay. You can do whatever you want. Just, it will give you polys. Just reconfigure. Do whatever you want. There are some limitations. Like if you have very small sections, sometimes the Dynamesh will cause like little holes and things in your meshes. But for the most part, like if you're just building out like a concept bust like we're doing, and you're just dragging out sections, and you keep reconfiguring the Dynamesh whenever you make any larger changes, you'll be good, right? So the point I made earlier was that you don't really need a whole lot of polys in the Dynamesh stage. You can, I mean, you can if you want, but I'm just going to make a distinction because there are two different things. There's the Dynamesh, which is really nothing magical. It's just this feature that's enabled. You can enable it for any mesh, right? You go into the tool menu, you go down to the geometry. There it is, Dynamesh. And as long as this is enabled, it will reconfigure the mesh based on the resolution when you hit control and you do that. That's it. But that little thing is just, like I said, it seems trivial, but it has kind of revolutionized the way you'd work digitally with creature and character creation. Because you start with the sculpt. Everything is in the sculpt. The better you can make the sculpt look, and then later you could just retopologize and to whichever output you want. Whether it's very low poly or even if it's a very low poly, you can make it look pretty good. Because you.
So you could say you used to work with Lego and now you're working with clay.
Yeah, you used to work with Lego first, and then you would add clay, and then you would bake the clay onto the Lego to make it look like the clay is there, but it's not. If the clay being the details, you'd still have ZBrush. It hasn't changed like tremendously. You still had the ability to go into ZBrush and sculpt and add detail and bake that down into a normal map, which would then appear in the game engine and look like the details are there, even if they're not. But now we can just go crazy in the concept and really get this to a high level of fidelity, and then just we're not worrying about the technicalities right now. We don't even know what we're making. It could be, the sky's the limit. Just make something cool, and then later on in November, we will think about, okay, so how do you want this character to be? How many polys? That's all up to you. You want a high poly character, or are you trying to go for like a mobile game thing, which will be very highly optimized? But the point is, you can do several outputs based on the same sculpt. You retopologize it any which way you want. And then you have UVs, and you bake everything down as normal maps. So all these little details and everything that we put in the sculpt will show up in Game Engine on your production mesh. Or if it's in a VFX pipeline and you're rendering it, it would be displacement maps. But I guess maybe you'll have displacement. You do have the ability to do like some displacement now in Game Engine also. But for characters, mostly you do normal maps. Like you can tessellate things and in Engine as well. So that's the main thing with the Dynamesh. You can essentially do whatever you want. Yep. Okay. Let's leave this thing behind. I'm gonna initialize ZBrush. This is a way to just quickly restart ZBrush. You go initialize ZBrush. Oh, let me show you how to save things in case you might want to save what you currently have. You can. Let me show you first what you don't want to do. You do not want to save the document. The document is this thing here. It's not. It will not keep your model. If you save the document, you'll lose your work. Basically, because let me show you what the document is. So currently, this thing has been in edit mode. If I go out of edit mode, it's still there, but now it's dropped down to 2.5D more or less. It's pixels with depth information. So I can keep drawing in this character here in this strange world of pixels with depth information. And this is not going to clog up anything. It's just like it's dropping it there. This is very weird. No one uses ZBrush this way, but initially ZBrush was made to be this illustration tool. You can still use it like that, but no one does. So essentially, yeah, who knows? It's still there. It's clunky. But if you hit Control N, that will clear the document. And I still have my tool here that I was working on. That's over here in the tool palette. It's here. This is my sculpt. A tool in ZBrush, a C tool, is the sculpt. I can draw it in one time. If I draw it in several times, I'm starting to do the same thing that I just did. I'm dropping it down. I don't want to do that. Control N, new document. I draw it in one time. And then I go Edit Object. Now I can rotate it around and everything's good. So essentially, you can also press F if you want to frame the object. That's nice. So essentially, we will obviously always be working in ZBrush in the edit mode. It's just so you know, because sometimes the following can also happen. You'll be working and then this will happen. Oh no, I dropped it down there. I broke it. Oh, again, what's happening? And you don't know what's going on. So now I'm dropping different versions of this down to the pixels, which is a feature in here on Shift S. But just so you're aware, you can just hit Control N and all of that will go away. So you're just making a new document. I guess it's a little bit useful if you're going like this and you hit Shift S and you're dragging this over here and you can do like a comparison, or if you want to show this off very quickly to your collaborators or whoever wants to see. Now, okay, there you go.
Is it possible to have the same model, view the same model as you work on it from different angles?
I don't think so. So Control N, that will clear the document, and everything that's left in edit mode is what you'll see. Alright, so what you don't want to do then is save the document, because then you're only saving those pixels with depth information and you lose your work. So either you can save file, save as, that will save the ZBrush project file. It's called ZPR, ZBrush project. You can consider unchecking undo history, because it can create very large files, especially if you have very heavy objects, like a lot of millions of polys, and then you keep doing things, and you have
Hours of work, maybe?
yeah, and this happen. Yeah, what's that?
Is there a way to pare down your history if you want to keep the last like 50 changes or around 40, 20?
There might be. I'm not
That
sure.
should be an option. We did explore that last year.
Really?
Yeah.
Could be.
Not even closets, but
Yeah.
So you can avoid having a big huge file.
But having there's
it's like you've seen the undo history in Photoshop. If you open the entire thing, you would get like a big fucking list, and you can choose what on that list you want to delete.
It seems like here, if you go into the preferences, undo history, max undo history. So essentially, if you lower that, it will do what you're saying. Like it will not keep adding. So this is set to 10,000. So I guess that would be 10,000 strokes. You know, a lot. So that's a good point. You can do that. But essentially, what I would rather do is to save some iterations. So if you save often, have some iterations. Because in any case, you do not want everything in one file. The same thing here happens, that sometimes things get corrupt, and you can no longer open it. Yeah. Anyways, so what I usually do, I just turn that off, and I don't have history. And you save as, and that's like CPR, ZBrush project. The other format you can also use, so the CPR will include everything. There are also here you have different materials. The current material that's on here is matte cap gray. There are two different types of materials. These are just like for your own viewing. You know, it's not going to be exported or anything. It's just here in ZBrush you have a lot of different materials. So the two main types of materials here are the matte cap and the standard materials. The matte cap materials have light information baked into them. So if I want to look at the gold, this has obviously reflection map and lighting baked into the material. So it makes it very quick. I mean, I can still just keep sculpting. You know, if I am doing something that will look more or less like gold. I mean, honestly, I never do this. Whenever I sculpt, I usually just do matte cap gray or standard material, because it just reads the form. I'm able to see the forms very clearly. You know, you really want a clear read of what it is that we're doing, and I think you'd find that. Yeah. Anyways, you can experiment with it, but maybe then if you are making something that you know would be like gold, or you could just have a quick look at. Okay, that's cool. But yeah. Okay, so but the thing here is that these other materials at the bottom, the standard materials, there you can also change the light source. So you can see here there's a little light menu, and I can change the direction of the light. That's very useful because when we're sculpting, we don't want to always be looking at the sculpt from the exact same lighting conditions, because probably the character or whatever it is that you're doing will need to be in different lighting conditions. So sometimes you want to go in here, see what it looks like from light over here or coming from underneath. Like that. And that will not work with the matte caps because they have the lighting baked into them. There is a way to change that also in the matte caps. If you want, you can go to the material modifiers, and here, you know, essentially you can change settings here. Anyways, let's get back to that. So where were we? So we were going to talk about okay, so those are the two main things, project file or C-tool. The project file will keep everything, so materials, textures, whatever you have in here, it will be stored, and you open it and it's the way you left it. The C-tool is a tool you can is a format you can consider if you really all you have is a sculpt. So currently we only have a sculpt that we care about here. So that it could also save it as a C-tool. That will include also all subtools. We have not talked about subtools yet. Let me briefly talk about subtools before we get on to the new topic. Okay, So currently there's one subtool. Anyway, so yeah, the CTL, the C tool format, will keep the subtools and everything you need for the sculpt, essentially. So we only have one object. There's only one subtool. We can go down here to append subtool. Then we'll get a list of things that are in here. We can also, of course, import OBJs from Maya or whatever, append. But let's just append a little sphere, and we'll try to make an eyeball out of a sphere. So initially we can tumble around, and now we can see that sphere is just stuck in his head.
I can't go back into edit mode.
Try drawing it again on your canvas, and then press T. T is for edit mode, or just click edit mode. And then click Control N to clear the document of anything else that's not in edit mode. Did it work? Okay. So now we see the sphere is just like tucked in his head. We have to move the sphere. Okay, so we click the sphere. Now we're on the sphere. The guy disappeared because the eye icon there is not enabled, so let's enable the eye. So the layers here are not hierarchical in any way, so it's not like in Photoshop where you have, the order doesn't matter. It's just a way for us to select things. So here I can select the sphere. I can click W, or I can go here to move. So currently we've only been in draw, right? We've been C adding or C subbing and using brushes, then we're in draw. Now we're going to use move. So you click move. If you're on the 2018 version, your cursor will look like this. This is very intuitive, like it looks like Maya kind of a thing. This is a nice addition. I mean, ZBrush didn't used to have a transform tool. It did, but it's very different. And if you happen to be on 4R7, I think some of the machines are currently on the previous version. Are you? Or no? You have this icon? Okay, good. Well, if some of you don't see that icon, you're on the other version, which looks like this. So if you click this icon in 2018, you can go back to the old school. Does anyone, when you click move, do you see this or do you see that? Does everyone see this?
I'm way behind.
Okay. All right. Anyways, but let me cover this anyways. So, I mean, this is so intuitive. It's just scale and move like you're used to. But the traditional one is a transpose tool. It works by drawing out a transposed line. I'm just going to cover that. So you draw out a line. I can hold shift to snap if I want to make it a straight line. If I'm in move, I need to hover over the middle circle, and then so that the middle circle, the circle in the circle appears, and then I can grab it and move it around. Yay. Or from this angle, draw out the line and move it like this. Or if I want to scale it, I can draw a transpose light straight down and go to scale. Hold shift, now using the bottom circle and scaling. So this seems a little unnecessarily complicated, and it is, but you can also, it's interesting for rotate. Like if I rotate from up here, it will rotate based on the bottom pivot. If I rotate from down here, we'll use the top pivot, I thought. Yeah, it does. And here, if I hold shift, I can rotate around that middle pivot. It's kind of, it's interesting. It has its uses. But for now, if you're on the 2018, this will be a little bit more user friendly if you're just moving things around. Or so we thought. Let's see. Scale. Okay, there we go. We should be able to place that in there. Let's make an eyeball. So this is how, you could do this. You just carve out a section for the eye socket, then snap, put an eyeball in there, and then you can keep sculpting on the mesh to define like eyelids, and it would require some attention, but this is how it's done. So in the production mesh then, we do want a completely enclosed mesh, so the eye sockets would have a continuous mesh, the mouth cavity would have a continuous mesh, So it's all closed off, but then you put objects in there. So eyeballs, teeth, gums, those could be separate objects that we just put in there. Alright, and now I could, if I go to draw, so QWER, I can toggle between these. Now I'm in draw. I can automatically mirror this over on C plugin Subtool Master mirror. And mirror it across the x-axis, and it asks, do you want to merge it into one subtool? Okay. So now it's one subtool containing those two eyeballs. So as long as I'm on the eyeball icon, or this subtool, I can sculpt on that. So I can even activate symmetry and sculpt on both. So if I alt click, I can also click to change the subtool, or just click here, and then keep sculpting. So clay buildup, we're defining it a little bit more. So I'm closer in, maybe lower a draw size, trying to define something that would look more like eyelids. So again, I wouldn't worry too much about art content for now. Just have fun with this, but do try to implement some subtools like eyeballs. We could do teeth or accessories. Damien standard to accentuate some of this. Maybe, let's see. So, yeah. But don't get too bothered with these tiny details in your early pass. Like, you do want to stay in that low resolution and work your way throughout the character before you start defining too much. So, you know, this would probably be okay for the definition of those eyes. I don't have to really go in here and make it any more defined than this at this stage, because this is the current stage I'm working at. I'd rather be, you know, just go over the character at this current level of definition, which would be we're still sort of in the primary stage. Like, remember I showed you you divide the task into 3 stages. Typically. It's not a rule, but it's kind of a nice little mental guide, you know. It's getting a little interesting. So, I mean, in the concept sculpt, you could do anything. So if you want to add like accessories, even if it's a part of the same mesh, even, you know, I could just sculpt and keep sculpting. But probably it's easier if you to accessorize this. Let's say you wanted to add a piece of clothing. You can also do like a mask here and an extract based on a mask. Let's not get into that. There's an example of that on one of the tutorial videos, and just so we don't, I think we should cover now basic subdividing, which is not Dynamesh. So for these conceptual sculpts that you're doing, see how far can you take it in the primary stage. And then if you want to take it further, yeah, you can add more. You can then add more resolution to the Dynamesh and take it a little bit further. But you don't have to take it crazy far in terms of detailing, because that's actually something that's a little bit easier to do once you have retopologized it. Now you can, of course, if you choose to do it here, you can, while working in Dynamesh. It's just that you have to then be, I think, a little bit good at working linearly, so that first you achieve sort of the maximum effect in the primary stage. You're happy with all the volumes, you know, you've experimented enough at that stage, and then you move on to the secondary stage to define it more, so that it's a more linear process. Because with the Dynamesh, you can't really go back and forth. It's like you define it at this stage, then you add more resolution, and that's it. Whereas with standard subdividing, you can go back and forth, and that's what I'm going to show you now. It's not Dynamesh. So let's leave Dynamesh. I'm going to save this. Yeah, whatever. So let me initialize ZBrush. I think we'll take maybe a little 10-minute break, and then I'll start talking about normal standard like subdivision levels. And then we'll look at very quickly how we can actually take something from Maya, take it into ZBrush, and just subdivide it normally, like not using Dynamesh necessarily. All right. All right. So let's look at standard subdividing in ZBrush, not using Dynamesh. So I just open again up the Dynamesh sphere, which seems strange since we're not going to talk about Dynamesh. But we're going to turn off Dynamesh. So we go down here, geometry, just turn it off. Under tool, geometry, turn it off. If I go like that, right now nothing happens. So it's not recomputing anything. So I made this little guy last session. If you have any object in Maya, you want to export it over, you can obviously also use ZBrush to make some tertiary details like wear and tear, surface detail, whatever you want to do, and then bake those out as normal maps, for instance. So you can export anything as an OBJ, and ZBrush will accept OBJs. So I have that one on the desktop, so I can go. Let me just initialize again. I thought I would do that sphere, but let's just import that object. So whichever OBJ you have, you can import it. Let's go here, import. If you're on the simple brush, if you have a lot of things in here, whichever you have currently selected will be here, right? So now I'm on the simple brush. That's the one that's here. Since I cannot replace the simple brush, if I import something, this is not going to go away. Whereas if I have a lot of different objects, whichever is selected when I hit import will replace that currently selected object. So that's why when you're importing things, you can just click the simple brush and then import. Oh, not clone. Whoops. I have a lot of simple brushes. Anyways, import. If you want to make an OBJ real quick, even well, we could do that. Just make something. Make a cube. Just try the process. See if you can get it over. Just make anything, like a little cube, and extrude a couple of something. As long as it's a legal mesh. Right. I'm gonna smooth it. So there's a little base mesh. That's going to be it. Delete history. And then export. So here we can be mindful again, like reminding back to the CG asset course, CG art 1 course where you made assets. The C axis should always be pointing with the front of the object. So right now this would be the front of the object. It's okay, fine. Just so we're aware of the alignment here. So down here at the left bottom, the z-axis this will be the front of the object because the z-axis is pointing that way. X is always the width. Okay, so then export, selection, and export as obj export. You can turn off materials. We don't need to necessarily export a material with this. That's the only thing. And then, yeah, this is a thing. Export, selection. So I just put that on the desktop. In ZBrush, hit import, thing. There I have it. I can just draw that one time into the canvas, and if I let go, press T, I can go to edit mode. And as we predicted, we see now that's what we're looking at in the front, because this is the front of the object. That's the alignment. I can press P to turn on perspective. Also, I can click there. So now we're looking at obviously exactly the same thing as we're looking at in Maya. We can also change the material here. If I want the basic material, I usually use that. And there it is. Same thing, Shift F, I can see the wireframe. So let's say you have something like this, or whatever it is. You have the curvature is already established. The model is done. You're done with the model. Then we don't need Dynamesh. Dynamesh is only for, like we talked about before the break. Like you can do anything you want, but basically changing contours, making big changes, and updating the topology. Here, we don't want to touch the geometry. Let's say the topology. Let's say the topology is done. Maybe you even have UVs for it already. So, you know, in that case, we don't want to mess with the topology at all. But we need more polys. You know, we can't do anything with it yet. Well, we can, you know, but it's very crude. So if you wanted to, for the purposes of adding like surface detail or something, we still want a lot more polys. So we can go to geometry, and you see there's a divide button. Now there are two different ways of dividing. There's dynamic subdivision or normal divide. Dynamic subdivision is just like pressing 3 in Maya. Like you can go back and forth. So I can turn it on or turn it off. Right, which is obviously useful if you're doing hard surface modeling in ZBrush. That's what it's for. It's not useful though for organic sculpting, but you can still activate it obviously even if you're working with an organic character. So if you find that sometimes ZBrush becomes very slow, like when you're trying to do brush strokes and it seems like the brush is kind of lagging and the change is taking a long while to compute, that usually should never happen in ZBrush, and probably you enable dynamic subdivisions without knowing it, because that can really lag things down when it's enabled for sculpting. So the reason it's kind of easy to do that without willfully doing it is because it's on D, which is But in 2018 now you get a warning. You did not get this in 4R7 or R8. But now it says, do you really want to enable dynamic subdivisions, or yes or no? So just be aware of that, because it usually happens. So that it will become very difficult to work with. Then just go in here and check under dynamic subdiv if you have it enabled, and if it's enabled, you can simply just click there once and it will go away. Okay. But the other way of dividing it, you can just click here or Control D. So not just D, but Control D. Whoops, wrong button. So Control D. Now we're dividing. We're not dynamically subdividing, but we're actually dividing. So that's literally the same thing as pressing smooth in Maya. So every smooth you do in Maya, each poly quadruples each time. You're getting like a you know, obviously like a smooth effect. The exact same thing is happening here. So each time I'm pressing Control D, I'm quadrupling the poly count. So it's an exponential growth, and you know, in a few clicks we have a lot of polys. So if now we're at subdivision level 7, it's at 1.7 million. If I click one more time, we're at 6.8 million. I can see that here. So around 6.8 million polys. Now, we could try one more time, depending on your computer. And 27 should be okay. I mean, you don't need to go higher essentially than you need. I mean, if you have enough resolution to do these surface details, going higher is just a waste of data and time, because it will also complicate baking normal maps and so forth. But essentially, okay, so 27 million, maybe that's a little excessive, but okay, let's see if this works. That's on subdivision level 9. So there's no exact number to this, it just depends on the poly count you start out with. You know, if you start out with a heavy mesh, 9 subdivisions later, you're going to be having a very high poly count, because it quadruples every time. If you have a few polys, you're not going to have that many. So let's do a drag rectangular stroke, and I'm going to change the alpha to whatever, this one, and set it to C sub, and I'll turn down the C intensity and just drag that onto the surface. Let's increase the C intensity a little bit. So that's okay. Let's do CC add for a bit more fun effect. So that's, you know, actually displacing all those vertices. So since we have now really a high definition here to work with, 30 million polys, this can become very accurate. You know, you could add, let's try to add something that would be a little more apparent. Maybe this intricate pattern. You see, there's a lot of resolution. That's not a texture. It's actually displacing the surface. But you can see even at 30 million, it's not perfect. That also has to do with the initial polygon distribution. So if you can imagine if this is going to quadruple every time. Here we have a very close spacing. I mean, this is okay. It's pretty even. It's pretty even. It's not a big deal. But sometimes if we had much less optimized meshes, so let's say you get rid of these, now there's a big difference. There's a big difference here, but this will then you'll have a huge amount of polys up here. You know, several millions, maybe 10 million up here, but here you won't have that many. Well, you have many, but you know, relatively speaking. So then it becomes uneven, and it's not highly optimized. So one thing to consider, like if you're going to do this, if you're going to send meshes over to ZBrush to be adding tertiary, you know, scratches and things, there's a lot of interesting things you could potentially do. You could optimize the polygonal distribution. So you'd actually go into there and add an edge loop if you find that, well, maybe I need an extra edge loop here to make it more even. Right? Does that make sense? So that has to do with that. So even at 30 million, but it's pretty good. Obviously, it's enough. So C sub, see, I can really do some interesting things. Now we're just dragging out that alpha. Let me go down one level. So Shift D, I can actually go down. So Shift D, I'm going down one subdivision level. Shift D again, Shift D, Shift D, Shift D. Back down to the bottom. Or I can use this slider, but it's a little bit easier to use D or Shift D. So now we're going to use D. Because now we already have subdivision levels, so it's not going to enter dynamic subdivision levels. It's only if you have a mesh that currently has no subdivision levels and you hit D, you're asking ZBrush to enter dynamic subdiv. That's why it's telling you, hey, you have no subdivision levels. Do you want to activate dynamic subdivision? But if you have subdivisions, which we currently do, you can press D or Shift D, and I can just toggle between different subdivision levels. And this is very interesting because if I'm at the bottom level, I can still do changes here. So if I go BMV to go to Move Tool, and I do something like that, I'm changing now the model a little bit. If I go back up, D, 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 you can see that the surface detailing I did is there. It's just moved accordingly. So I can make changes to the mesh at any subdivision level and go back up and down. You know, it doesn't matter. So this is very powerful. So if I do want to be making large changes, I can go back down. If I only want to be working with the tertiary shape, like these little details, I'll go back up. So I probably don't need like 30 million. You see that? See if it makes a big difference. It doesn't seem like... To me, it's not a difference that makes it worth it, like all that extra data for this. See the difference? Now I'm going from 30 million to 6 million or 7 million. No. Barely noticeable. So then I can just delete higher. So I'm on subdivision level 8 and I can delete higher. Now that's the highest level at around 7 million polygons. And it will be at least a little bit smoother to work with. But you know, it is doing this incredibly efficiently. So we have the drag rectangular, we have the spray, so I can spray this effect on. Let me decrease the C intensity. So just like I'm spraying this over the model, and it's displacing all of those vertices based on this alpha and the spray stroke. So there are other interesting things here. You do have something called a noise generator, like the noise, surface noise. It's also under the tool menu. So if I go tool and find surface, I can activate surface noise. So that opens up this window. And here you can do, it could be based on UVs. This object doesn't have any UVs because I haven't made any. So then it will use a 3D projection. But then I could do like strength. I could play around with the profile curve of the noise. You see what that does? So strength, scale of the noise. So these are all obviously procedurally generated, but you can play around with it and see the effect in real time, which is very interesting. And you can also drive these based on alphas. So you can import an alpha here, let's say like a fabric pattern or something, and then you could repeat that fabric pattern and just do that as a noise generator. There's also a noise plugin right here that opens up this. You have even more like fractal based, well, procedurally generated noise patterns of various sorts. Yeah. But I mean, if you're doing something that you quickly want to add some surface noise, this is interesting. And then you could also keep combining it, but I think we could have a look at it again. Just to give you that introduction that there is such a thing. So then I hit OK. But it's currently actually, it's not really baked down into the object. It's currently applied more or less like a map. So it just gives you that preview. I can turn on and off the noise. But then I can go apply to mesh. No, oh, sorry. This was the wrong button. apply to mesh. And there, it's baked down to the mesh. It's now literally, this is not dependent on anything, it's just, this is part of the geometry. So it's not a texture, it's actual geometry. So you're just looking at 7 million polys, and that's what they're giving you. It's not applied to them, no, you have to click apply to the mesh. So that's kind of the power of this, because now there's no trickery involved. But we're looking at, like I said, it's actual geometry, like it's there. And then there are some interesting possibilities with that. Like we could then generate like masking. We could do mask by cavity. Now it's doing a cavity. It's making a mask based on all of those little cavities. So if you wanted to do like dirt inside of all of those cavities, yeah. So I think we'll come back to this. But if you want to try it, I'm mentioning it. Now it's set to view mask, or I can turn that on and off. I can invert the mask. So now we've only looked at CAD. There's also a way to paint directly on models in ZBrush using RGB. So I'm turning, if you turn any brush, you can turn off. If I'm turning off CAD and activating RGB, it's essentially using the color. So we have a color palette here. You have a little color palette down here, but a bigger one here. So if I want to add, if I want to make a little map, so let's say like dirt, and if I just start painting now with RGB intensity set up, standard brush, and I start painting, you'll see that, but I toggle a bit to get rid of that artifact. There we go. So now it's painting that in based on that mask. You know, more or less successful, but you can generate these very interesting masks that could then be a part of whatever texturing workflow you're using. But anyway, the point here just being that you can, it's kind of powerful having access to, or having it as geometry, because you could then do interesting things with it, generating masks, so forth. Okay. So again, this is sort of what we'll get back to then when we were starting to do production meshes, and because then we're working with normal polygonal mesh, and then we're going to be baking the information from your basically what you're doing in the Dynamesh sculpts will be visible at the highest level, and then the lowest level will still be like a, you know, an animation friendly mesh. But then the point being that we can now bake all this information down onto the low poly mesh, and having all this appear either as a displacement map if you were to render it in a VFX pipeline, or as a normal map if you're doing games. So that's sort of the whole point of the process. So is that kind of, do you grasp that concept? Like, vaguely? Okay. But anyways, just for now, you can just be happy working in Dynamesh, keep developing these conceptual busts, and then just know that there are then other ways of doing standard subdivision levels, which again, we'll get back to that more when we're doing the production meshes. But if you want to already experiment with it, just take it, grab an OBJ, put it in ZBrush, see what happens. If you have creasing edges and everything else, the subdivision result you get in ZBrush will be very predictable, just like you have it in Maya. It's the same subdivision that happens. Oh, that's what I wanted to mention. The difference here between Dynamesh and regular subdivs. What else? So we covered subtools. Seems like it encountered some error. Gotta reboot. Reboot. Yeah, I think actually just spend a little time experimenting with volumes. See if you can get like a bust, and then you already have one. You know, your first ZBrush bust. So just to repeat the brushes, what we've used. So mainly clay buildup, BCB, move, BMV, Damien standard, BDS, and then pinch, BPI, and inflate, BIN. Yep.
Just a trivial question, really. Why is it called Damien Standard?
I think it's named after the artist who made it.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it does make sense.
So he had a presentation on the ZBrush Summit. Okay, so the few tutorials that I posted, I really encourage that you watch them because various artists have different approaches. I think it's interesting for you to see different approaches and choose your own. Like, what are you comfortable with doing? Let me see if I can get. Where's the canvas page? So I posted some in the reading list. There are a lot of them, but I posted like 4 that I really want you to see. So reading list. So these are all from the ZBrush Summit, which is the annual event. It's coming up pretty soon. So some of these are, let's just watch a few seconds of these, or a few minutes of this from Danny Williams. This is from 2014. But he's using Dynamesh. So yeah, I'll leave it to you to watch these, but just to briefly show you. Like he starts out with various shapes, like this just blocking out the character. So establishing different volumes. So he'll do these as separate. You see there, he just starts with a lot of different subtools. These are just spheres.
He starts with a really low resolution.
Yeah. So it's actually beneficial to start pretty low, like in the primary stage when you're blocking out forms. But this is it's an interesting approach because he's establishing different volumes and it's literally different meshes. So he has a few spheres that he's just like playing around with, figuring out volume and shape. See that the back of the skull is currently a different sphere. So he's just blocking these, much like you would do with clay, right? You just take this piece and put it in that piece, and then you can combine all of these into the same Dynamesh. So just fast forward, so that now he's combined it. Yeah, it's interesting. It's not my approach. Like I would just block things out from one sphere and keep going, and a lot of people do that. But there are different approaches. You can also start with like armatures, and there's no right way or wrong way. It's blocking out shapes. So he's using I don't know what brush that is. Probably, well, it might just be Alt Damien Standard, or there's also a slash brush, which is interesting. Yeah. So here you can also use masking. So he's made a mask onto the body, and then you can actually extract geometry based on the mask. So you can do clothing and different accessories, just literally draw a mask. Oh, we haven't really talked about that. It's very simple. You hold control and then you're actually entering the mask pen. So yeah, anyways, you can try it. If you hold control and draw on the model, you'll see that you're actually drawing a gray area. So like this, I'm drawing a gray area. This is now a mask. So if I try to do something to the mesh, like if I use a brush, you see I can't make any changes within that mask. I can also invert the mask. So if I hit control click once outside here, I'm inverting the mask. So now I can only make the change in here, which is handy. It's very handy. And to clear the mask, it's the same as you would do the Dynamesh. You just control, drag to the side. Actually, when you go to control, you can see you're activating the mask pen, which initially has nothing to do with Dynamesh. It's just that it incidentally it's set up at the same hotkey. When you go like that, you'll recompute the Dynamesh. You can also do interesting things like if I go like this with a mask, invert the mask, and I can go to that move tool and drag out. Whoops.
How did you invert the mask?
You just control and click once outside here. You can also do this in the masking menu. There's a masking menu here. So view mask, inverse, clear. So here I can actually move out that little region. See that? Because everything else is masked off. So when I move this out and symmetry is enabled, I can do that or in. And I clear the mask and I can reconfigure the Dynamesh and I'm good to go. So there are many interesting ways of generating shapes. There are also very powerful Boolean operations in the new 2018. But all of these features, they're just interesting for you to see and experiment with. And the best way to do it is to, like I said, you have to watch different artists work. You know, it's the best approach. So this is one, Danny Williams, and there are a few others here. Like, well, this guy I put on here is kind of interesting because he does little toy concepts. This might not be your thing, but just to show you that you can obviously do different things. He uses a little render called Keyshot, and you can get very quickly like renders like this straight out of ZBrush basically, but it bridges it over to this render solution called Keyshot. And I wish we had it here. We do have. I think we will get it soon. It's just not installed. I'm hoping they'll get it. But literally, it's like you can go here and render, and you go external render, Keyshot. When I now click this BPR, which stands for Best Preview Render, if Keyshot were installed, it would now ship this over to Keyshot, and we could have like physically based rendering with one click. It's extremely user friendly. You had a question? The move tool?
Yes.
You go here. Move.
Alright.
And then your move tool. So if Keyshot is not installed, which is not here, then the BPR has a different function. It still renders, but it uses ZBrush's internal render, like to give shadows and just... It's kind of a limited render. It's not a physically accurate or physically plausible render. So, but if you want like really nice, it's such a great render because you can get these conceptual sculpts presented like 10 times better, very, very quickly. So Keyshot has become this, and you can also do like what he's doing, like here, making it, makes it look like plastic, playing around with materials within Keyshot. So for any of you who want to be doing more conceptual work, I think Keyshot is kind of a must, because there are no UVs. You can also paint directly on the model in ZBrush and have that carried over to Keyshot. So it's not really, not used. It's not yet a production model, but you can really take that concept to a high level and really show what it's going to look like as a production model. So that's that. Yeah, just put these on when you're working or whatever. Ian Joyner is a good one. And there are a bunch of others, of course. If you search for ZBrush Summit, they've very inspirational videos. Dynamish sketching, using ZBrush to quickly sketch new idea. There's no audio. It's pretty cool. So dynamic sculpting, basically what you're doing. Yeah, so they printed. But it's just this great conceptual tool. So if you're working with scales and patterns like this, you could also find interesting alphas that you can actually import here. You can also make your own alphas in Photoshop pretty simply and import them as a PSD, and they'll work. So if you search for ZBrush alpha, scales or something, see there's a lot of interesting. Pixologic has their own little download center where you can find alphas, things like that. There's just so much experimentation that you can do. Here's a fabric pattern. So, yeah, we'll be looking more into various things when we do the full maquette. But if you can, just spend this time doing a lot of experimentation on your own. Watch tutorials, watch different artists, and just see how far you want to take these 3 conceptual busts. Is all up to you. I mean, the requirements for the class, it's not like you have to make amazing artwork at all. It's just, it's up to you how far you want to take it. Just, yeah, have fun with it. Skins, various skins. But these would then be more tertiary details. And like I said, we could probably better look at that a little bit later on. So you don't have to worry about skin patterns and stuff like that when you're fleshing out the primary shapes and the basic concepts. What else? That's interesting. Also, altering this simple base mesh of a rat or a mouse and just altering that shape into something more conceptual.
For the assignments, would we then be allowed to make a base mesh that imports to the ZBrush and sort of begin in mind?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you can do that. You can begin in Maya if you want, but you're sort of missing out on the whole Dynamesh experience. Because, like I said, the workflow here then becomes that Dynamesh is a very, very powerful conceptual tool. And then you don't have to worry about the base mesh or the topology or anything else, because you're sculpting. And then later we worry about the topology. But yeah, if you really want to model first, you can do that. But I would encourage you to spend time with Dynamesh, see how far you can take it, and if you can get familiar with it. So when you're looking in ZBrush at the sculpt, usually there are these gray models, and the initial stages are always a little bit discouraging. You're not, if you're looking at these beautiful final presentation renders, but just stick with it. See if you can't try to gradually take your sculpts like to next levels of detail. I do wish we had keyshot though. It would be a little bit encouraging, because you can potentially make something look pretty nice in a short amount of time. Okay, I think that was it in terms of what we needed to cover. I think you should be able to hammer out some conceptual busts. Yeah. Unless there are any questions. So it's all up to you. I mean, you could start thinking about some concepts you'd like to flesh out. Anything. Or just have fun playing around with shapes.
We only have some sessions a week, correct?
Yeah. And then, yeah, there's a TA for the class, Luai. You know Luai? He's very good in ZBrush, so he will be available. But it's it's up to him. He needs to figure that out. So he will be in touch with you. Which days he will be here, I'm not sure. But essentially, sometimes throughout, he'll be around. There are also other TAs on Mondays, I think, and there's some food being served. So I hear, I don't know, on Monday afternoons, I think. I don't know, I hear there's this new thing where they're going to start serving food and have TAs around on Monday nights. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, so that sounds nice. You should take advantage of that. And then, yeah, so Luai is the TA for the course. So you'll get some more information on when he's here, he's around. And yeah, so the next session we'll have basically will be in September, end of September. 24th or something like that. It's on Canvas. Let me have a look. 27 and 28. Yeah, right. So then it would be very nice if you are familiar in ZBrush and you've experimented with the brushes and you have done these conceptual busts until then.
But what's the extent of very well-made conception?
It does. No, it doesn't need. I mean, I don't mandate you to do very much at all. It's like I'm saying, it's up to you how far you want to take it. It's just like the whole point is just experiment with ZBrush. Spend time with various brushes, see what effects they have. I wouldn't worry too much, like I said, about the art content necessarily right now. Just don't worry so much. Just experiment, find some inspiration you like. And then the point is, I think next time, the next session we'll have, when we're starting with the full body maquette and everything, we'll also talk a little bit more about some like anatomical landmarks you can think about, like musculature and things like that, and fleshing. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. So the deadlines are all posted here. Here's the first PDF is September 24th. Oh, that's where I got the 24th from. Yeah, that's the deadline for the PDF. And then we'll be here at 27 and 28, and then we'll do the full maquette.
We will just have screenshots of our...
Yeah, just screenshots, and then, it would be nice if you can write like a paragraph or two, whatever. It's up to you. Take screenshots of your model and just like, you can refer to that Gibbs reflective cycle, where, how did you feel? How? Yeah, you don't have to follow that point by point by point. I felt like this and then I did that. Whatever. It's essentially just provide us a little bit of information. How did it go? What did you do? Simple. The most important thing is to include visuals, right? And then for this first assignment, it's not such a big deal, but later on, I guess it would be nice if you also show like progress, like for when you make the production model, what are the stages that you underwent, and so forth. Yep. If you're curious though about like the assignment and what goes into the assessment and what we're looking for, that's all in that assessment rubric. So you can go in there and read, okay, so if I want an A on the report, you know, and it says like, if you're a little more creative making the report, you know, like making us, you know, it's like you do a little bit of an effort to show that how you've worked. You know. Like I said, it's not so important for these first 3 busts, but it'll be a little more important for these a little bit more extensive ones. Okay, what else? Yeah, so that's that. And the hand-ins, then you'll find they're here. So assignments, this is where you'll hand in the PDFs. So they do need to be PDF though, like not JPEG or not PNG or anything else. So PDF in there. Oh, and yeah, so I guess you just make your own folder or whatever on the server, but then I put this there. So students CG artworks. I mean, if you have anything that you want to post, you want to share, we'd much appreciate it. You put it in here. So I just made that folder, so there's not much there. But then just, if you name it like that, like year, month, date, first name, last name, like that. So that would be nice if we have some artworks in here eventually. If you want to share it with people, you put it there. Okay? Okay. Questions? Concerns? We're good? This is pretty intuitive. You just have to get started.